104 cities had sales tax increases on the ballot this past November. With people complaining they are already paying too much in taxes, is this a matter of mismanagement in government, or is there something more to it? As always, there's way more to it than meets the eye. Let's talk about one key source of revenue that is still being greatly affected by a law passed 40 years ago. Stay tuned.
This is the Calamasa Insider Podcast, the original Pass Area City podcast, focusing on the ins and outs of your city government at work. And now here's the host of Calamasa Insider, City Manager Will Kolba.
Hello, and thank you for joining us this week. I don't know about you, but I've not been a fan of the weather in 2025 so far. Wildfires, relentless winds, power shutoffs. It's been a challenge, to put it nicely. Now, on the program side, I've been plugging our new social media push for the podcast, but don't forget, this is still a podcast. So if you can't watch on YouTube, make sure you subscribe on your favorite podcast platform like Spotify or Apple Podcasts or others. Make sure you to visit our link tree, which has all the links to all of our stuff. Also, please share the podcast with your neighbors and friends so we can spread the word. The goal is to get this podcast to as many Calamasa residents as possible. Now, before I get to our main topic of the day, just a quick update on the city council meeting this past Tuesday. Mayor Linda Molina made her appointment to the Library Commission, Julie Saba. So thank you, Julie, for your commitment to our city. We look forward to working with you on the Library Commission. It's an exciting time to be on that commission with the brand new library opening up this summer. Also, Councilmember Edgar Garcia appointed Luis Enciso to the Planning Commission with unanimous concurrence from the City Council. So congratulations to both Julie and Luis on your appointments. If you want to watch the full City Council meeting, you can do so by going to the city's YouTube page at calamasa.gov/YouTube and going to the live tab. Okay. Tax season is about to get underway, and our budget process here at the city, at least internally, is also underway. Now, given that timing, I feel it's an appropriate time to start talking about what is an uncomfortable topic for many of my colleagues, and that's taxes. Now, when people feel services are inadequate or infrastructure is not being built fast enough or too many roads are in poor shape, we immediately begin hearing about the amount of taxes they pay. In California, this has especially been espoused about how much we pay in taxes here. Now, for the people that are listening to this episode in audio only, I do apologize, as I will be using some graphics to really drive home the points I'm making, but I'll do my best to explain what is happening here. So with that, let's get to our PowerPoint presentation here. And, in a perfect world, we would have stable and robust services, low density, and low taxes with no compromise on any unwanted development. In reality, that's a fantasy. If you want stable services and low density, it requires higher taxes. Stable services and low taxes requires more density. And when we talk about density, that could mean more commercial and industrial development in addition to residential development. If you want low density and low taxes, then you'll have to sacrifice services. And I think that probably describes us best today in that there are those that think we have inadequate safety services, although we have demonstrated that is not the case. Those that want to see more parks and recreation services and amenities, and that many of our roads are in need of repair. Now, that last one, I agree is true. So as I stated before, I want to focus in on the taxes piece, and there's a lot to unpack. So for today, I will focus on property tax, and I'll explain why in a moment. Now, I gathered this data from a number of sources to come up with an average of what the per capita taxes are by type in total. However, this can vary widely from person to person and family to family, but it gives you a general idea of, one, the sheer number of taxes that we pay, and two, how much goes into each one. And I don't even know if I've captured them all, but I've tried to do as best I could to try to capture the major ones that we kind of think of. And that last point is extremely important. Most people complain about taxes without thought about where each one goes and what each one is used for. If we don't know that, then how can we have a conversation about what is the right amount of taxes and how much should be allocated to each type? Now, that's a larger philosophical question for another day. I want to focus in on Calamasa here. So if I focus in on just the city, that eliminates 57% of the taxes you pay in total. Now, granted, we may get some of that money in the forms of grants for some specific projects, but they cannot pay for ongoing services provided by the city. Now, we will look closer at each of these areas, but today I will focus again on Calamasa's largest revenue source, even if it's not the largest portion of your tax bill, property taxes. Wait, why is it that not sales taxes? Why is that not sales taxes if you pay more in sales taxes? The devil is as always in the details. So your property taxes go to different places, but the largest are the city and school districts. And we have 2 school districts, so the schools share a portion of property taxes, and each of those shares will go to the district in which you are located. In fact, the share is determined by what tax rate area you're in. And there are over 80 tax rates areas in Calamasa alone, each with its own distribution of property taxes. So where your neighbor's taxes go could be slightly different than where yours go. Typically, though, the proportion are pretty close. But if you go city to city, this graph will look vastly different as far as distribution. So there's also the fact that if you bought your house 5 years ago and your neighbor bought their house, say, 50 years ago, you might be paying many times higher than your neighbor, perhaps even 10 times as much or even more. So why are there these vast differences? As always, there's way more to this than people realize. So property taxes have been around for literally centuries. And in the United States, it dates back pre-revolution to the colonial days. Now, some states have no income tax or sales tax, but property taxes are one of the taxes that exist in one shape or another in all 50 states. Now, for the first 60 years of our state's existence, it was the largest form of state revenue. In 1900, as a matter of fact, 89% of California state taxes were derived from property taxes. Now, the Great Depression, however, depressed property values so much that the state had to diversify its revenue portfolio, so it shifted to focus on sales and income tax. Since 1933, property tax has been a locally levied, collected, and used tax by local governments. And when we say local governments, schools, cities, counties, etc. So things began to shift in the 1970s. A new focus on the environment brought the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. Freeway revolts have shaped our traffic patterns to this day. An increased population drove up property values, and with that, property taxes. Combine that with an eroding trust in government creates a recipe for reform. It culminated with one of the most impactful pieces of legislation in the history of California, Proposition 13, but in many more ways than people think. The way most people see it is that it lowered property taxes, which at the time was the largest form of revenue for most cities. But it also, for example, facilitated continued increases in property value because less paid in property taxes means more money is available for mortgages, increasing buying power. Additionally, lower property taxes means lower income tax deductions, thereby increasing income taxes. For local governments, it changed how property taxes were calculated and distributed and stripped all control over both of those aspects from local government and vested that power in the state, which is ironic considering the ongoing fight of the state taking power and choice away from local government. So what did Prop 13 do exactly? First, it set the total property tax at 1% statewide. So previously, each government would set their own rates. Local governments would set their own property tax rates based on the value of property in their jurisdictions, revenue from other sources, such as sales tax, and political will. So there was politics in that involved as well. Second, it rolled assessed values back to 1975-76 levels and capped growth in the assessed value by the lesser of inflation, or 2%. So if inflation was, say, 3%, assessed values would go up by only 2%. But if inflation was only 1%, assessed values would also only go up by 1%. And if inflation was negative, the rates would actually go down. They only reset to market value when a property is sold or transferred to another owner. In most cases, previously, the county assessor assessed properties based on its market value. Now, the consequence of these two actions alone reduce property tax revenues by more than half, and that growth has never kept up with inflation. It delegated authority of calculating the distribution of property taxes to the state. Now, remember, at this point, property tax was and still is a local revenue source. The state does not receive any property taxes directly, but this authority over distribution can be manipulated to benefit the state budget, as we will explore in a moment. So first, what does that shift to 1% in the cap growth look like over time? If you had a house that was valued at $100,000 in 1976, and you've held on to it since then, and your property tax rate was, let's assume was equal to what it became as 1%, your property tax has gone from $1,061 in 1979 to $2,404 in 2025. However, if it had increased at the rate of inflation, it would be $6,477 in 2025. So the savings has been significant, but unfortunately, governmental costs are subject to the forces of inflation, like every other cost outside of property taxes. Now, I will say property values have increased overall at a greater rate than inflation. So for newer properties or when properties sell, some of that quote unquote loss to inflation is recovered. This is why new development is so impactful on a city's ability to provide services. As a result of Prop 13, California is in the lower half in terms of property tax rates at number 34 in the country. Now, how much you pay in property taxes is a different story because of values, which then throws things into greater disparity. Since valuations are not based on market value, homes sold more recently will have a much higher property tax than those that have been owned for a long time, even if the rate is the same. So because of this, even though the property tax percentage is 1%, the effective rate is lower at 0.67%. Now, lots of other states do it the way we used to do it. Texas, for example, ranks number 7 in terms of rates with an effective rate of 1.47% because each local government sets their own rates and properties are reassessed to market value on a regular basis. With the real estate market booming in Texas, property taxes as a dollar amount have increased dramatically as a result. So our current distribution was set in 1979. Now, this is when the emerging technology was home computers, video game systems, and VCRs. There was no internet to speak of, and the next great thing in land development was indoor shopping malls. And oh, by the way, that was the year I was born. Initially, each county allocated property tax based on their average property tax revenues in the 3 years preceding fiscal year 1978-79. Every year after that, they allocated based on the previous year's allocation plus a share of the growth in tax revenue resulting from increases in assessed values in the jurisdiction. In other words, we are allocating property taxes today based on the needs that were identified by various local government in the mid-1970s. Now, initially, the state used its newly inherited power for good. As I said before, the state did get a windfall as a result of Prop 13, so they did use that by shifting some cost burdens. The state increased distributions to cities and counties by lowering distributions to schools, then increased the state's funding of the schools to make the schools whole. Now, this did mark the beginning of the burden of school funding being shifted to the state, which is continued to accelerate to this day. So what does that mean for Calamasa? What does it look like here? One thing of note, Calamasa incorporated in 1990, so the share of 10.06% would have been going to the county and county service areas that served Calamasa when Prop 13 was enacted. When a city incorporates, a calculation is done to determine what portion of the county share and the CSAs are needed to fund city operations. Now, the fire piece of 19.72% was present when Prop 13 was enacted, but went to Riverside County Fire. When the city incorporated, the city also inherited the fire portion, then turned around and contracted with the county for fire services. The fire property tax goes into the city's general fund. Now, previously I said that property tax distribution can differ widely from cities to cities. So let's compare us to Beaumont and Banning, two cities that are much older than Calamasa. A couple of things of note here. The school district shares are pretty close to the same for all three cities, with Banning just under 35% and Calamasa and Beaumont both in the 37% range. Now, the county fund share in both Beaumont and Banning are significantly higher than Calamasa. Additionally, you will note that Calamasa does have a separate fire component while Banning and Beaumont do not. So even though Beaumont and Banning city portion is higher than Calamasa, the fire portion puts us at nearly 30%. So fast forward, and lo and behold, shortly after the allocations are set and the bailouts began, a recession hit. The state budget in 1981 was in a deficit. And I guess some things never change. Now, that year, the state enacted its distribution of liquor license. The state ended, its distribution of liquor license fees to cities and counties, along with highway carriers, uniform business taxes, and the short-lived Financial Aid to Local Agencies Fund, which was created in 1979. Then we hit another recession in the early 1990s. To plug yet another state budget hole, the legislature created the Educational Revenue Augmentation Fund, or ERAF. Remember the shift from the bailout in 1979? Yep, that's right. That's about the end of that is near. In 1992, the legislature directed that specified amounts of city, county, and other local agency property tax be deposited in the ERAF, and school funding from the state general fund was then reduced by a commensurate amount, so that the losses to cities, counties, and special districts equated to a gain for the state general fund. 1993 brought an additional deficit, and this time they directly targeted the 1979 bailout and permanently shifted that bailout to the ERAF. This was in addition to the ERAF shift in the prior year, so both of these ERAF shifts continue to this day. So what was the impact by the ERAF shifts in Calamasa? So all of the agencies in orange listed here had funds shifted away. That's the city, county flood control, San Gregorio Pass Water Agency, the county general fund, the Summit Cemetery District, the county library, the county regional park, and Beaumont Cherry Recreation and Park District. Notably, besides school districts and community colleges, the fire share, YVWD, and San Gregorio Pass Hospital did not lose any property taxes to ERAF. So if we take away those and put it into the ERAF, now the ERAF gets about 8.6% of the total share of property taxes. The county lost half of its property tax to ERAF, while Calamasa lost about 12.5%, bringing our share down to 8.8%. So a side story really quick here. Vehicle license fees, or VLF, contrary to popular belief, are not for roads. It's a property tax. Unsecured real property such as RVs, boats, airplanes, and even large manufacturing equipment is assessed for property tax. When vehicles began to really take off in the 1930s, and because of the mobile nature of cars, it became very difficult for county assessors to keep track. So the state took responsibility for this task and collected VLF which was then distributed back to the cities and counties. The VLF rate historically was 2%. In 1998, the state wanted to cut this rate, but since it was a local revenue, they couldn't do so directly. So what they did was they cut the rate, then backfilled the difference to local governments to make them whole from the cut. So end users got a tax cut, cities still got their whole revenue, and the state paid for the difference. And the state at that time was doing extremely well in the late 1990s. Think .com boom. Now, fast forward to 2004, and we found ourselves in yet another recession and state budget deficit. However, Because of the long-term effects of Prop 13 and the ERAF shifts in the 90s, the well of having local governments bail out the state began to run dry. Initially, the idea was to increase the VLF back up to 2% to eliminate that backfill, which is what they did initially. But this was about around the time of the recall of Gray Davis, and Arnold Schwarzenegger ran on a platform of reducing the VLF back down. So the idea of the triple flip was born. Here's how it works. You can see the graphic here. The VLF rate was reduced to 0.65%, thus restoring the effective rate that was enacted in 1998. But instead of the state backfilling the VLF money, cities instead received money from the ERAF. Now, since the ERAF was reduced, the state had to increase its funding of schools by the same amount. Hence why in this graph, it shows the state receiving $4.4 billion from VLF, then the state sending $4.4 billion to the schools, and the schools via ERAF sending $4.4 billion to the cities and counties to make up for their loss of VLF. So after 2004, cities and counties, with few exceptions, received no VLF. In the long run, though, this has been beneficial to cities, as the growth in the amount received from property taxes in lieu of VLF has increased at a faster rate than the VLF revenue has, I should say. This VLF property tax swap is why cities actually end up with a little more property tax than the school districts. So after all the states swapping and messing with local governments, cities had enough. So in November of 2004, voters passed Proposition 1A, constitutionally protecting major city revenues, including property taxes. However, previous shifts were allowed to stay, most namely the ERAF shifts in the 1990s. So what does this all mean for Calamasa? I know there's a lot of information there. Well, looking at residential valuations, this shows bars of every residential property in Calamasa that has its own parcel. So mobile homes that rent spaces, for example, are not included here. The orange line represents the median assessed value, which is $382,602. The green line is the median home sales price in Calamasa for the fourth quarter of 2024, which is $550,000. This is in the 89th percentile of assessed values in Calamasa, meaning that 89% of assessed values are lower than the median home value in Calamasa. This would look even more disparate in older cities that are largely built out. Looking at just one street, Douglas, I ranked the valuations of all the homes from lowest to highest. So in this particular case, you have a low of $31,597 to a high of $666,896. Looking at one block can make some sense, right? Because when you consider the service needs of a single street are all pretty similar, yet you have one homeowner paying over 21 times more for those same services. So let's compare this to a newer street in town. Chestnut Road is a part of Phase 1 of Summerwind. So here we see a vastly different picture. So most of the valuations are very close, but we also see this is one of the higher end cities in our streets in our city, as all but 2 of the assessed values are above the median assessed value for the city, and all but 3 of the assessed values are above the median sales price. Now, as an aside, how do we have 2 assessed values that are well below the others? Well, there are other propositions that have been passed over the years that homeowners that are 55 and older take their assessed valuation with them. So if they live somewhere else for a long time and sold their home to buy here, they can take their old assessed value and apply it to their new home, regardless of how much they paid for it, as long as their new house is worth less than what they sold their previous house for. So when you combine our regular property taxes with the property taxes received in lieu of VLF, the city gets about 63% of its general fund revenue from property taxes. Now, remember, we have no control over this. We are at the mercy of the formulas and growth tied in Proposition 13, and property turnover, which is about 2% per year here in Calamasa. Now, tax policy is always a tricky thing, but Prop 13 has created a large amount of disparity with people paying widely varying amounts of the same services. The disparity and artificial suppression in the growth of revenues is a big driver in why cities are seeking out other forms of revenue, and why things that produce large amounts of sales tax are so much more attractive. And so it used to be that malls and shopping centers were the big sales tax producers, but with the shift in consumer habits, and as unpopular as it might be to say, the most bang for your buck, so to speak, is fulfillment centers. But it also has led cities to seek sales tax increases, one thing that the city has full control over if they are approved by voters. Now, that means it's no wonder over 100 cities, which is over 20% of all cities in California, had sales tax measures on the ballot this past November. Finally, one big item of note: this view of property tax does not include community facilities districts, or what is known as Mello-Roos, although Mello-Roos was legislation that was passed as a direct result of Prop 13. I'll cover this next week, along with some other propositions that have impacted and restricted city revenues. So there's a lot to unpack here. I realize that. And, obviously we want to make sure that, I hope that this shows that tax policy and what we pay is a lot more complicated than meets the eye. Now, we are expected to provide a multitude of services at a consistently high quality, despite constant shifts and attacks on that revenue. So the question I will leave with you is this: given that it would be a monumental shift to change the distribution of all the taxes you pay, especially at the federal and state level, do you want to pay more, develop more, or change the scope of local government services? We're now 46 years into Proposition 13, and its impacts on how local government operates continue to reverberate and will only continue to do so. So with that thought, we will go ahead and wrap up the show for this week. Don't forget, our next city council meeting is Monday, February 3rd at 6 p.m. at the Norton Young Love Civic Senior Center. You can catch it live in person or on the city's YouTube page by going to calamasa.gov/YouTube. We are both audio and video on this podcast, so subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast app, or even better, do both. Follow me on Instagram and TikTok, both at Calamasa Insider, all one word, where you will find bonus content as well. Until next time, have a great weekend, and I will talk to you again next Friday. Take care, everybody.